Alright YouTube, time for yet another occult video. I promised one on the topic of Atlantis, and I'm going to go into a little more detail about the same sort of things that I mentioned before, that I said I would talk about, the sort of stages that the Atlantis myth has been built upon, my own thoughts about what probably actually happened, and to that one commenter who said that the Israelis under King David were communicating with the Americas across the Atlantic. There's no evidence of that, nor is there anything in Jewish scriptures to actually talk about such a place. What we have are the Egyptians and the Greeks primarily are the ones saying these things, and they had the technology necessary to do so. The Judeans at the time were not particularly skilled with seafaring. They were more into their chariots and archers and things of that nature. So be that as it may. The first step in the Atlantis mythos really is the account by Plato, and these accounts simply state, these claim to be based on older manuscripts, on older tales from Egypt. Essentially what the Egyptians said was this, that there was such a place, very real, physically real, very advanced culture on an island which was formed out of concentric rings. That part is kept accurate in most retellings of the story. That it was mostly a utopian land. There was peace and plenty and wealth, and they had technology that was higher than the other cultures around them. However, one thing we've got to understand is that higher technology in the sense of that period would have been ironworking, would have been horse-drawn carts or something like that. Something like that you would see, in the medieval era or the Renaissance would have seen like high technology back then. Multi-story buildings used by the average citizen would have been considered quite advanced. Anything approaching modern architecture, peaked roofs and stuff, that would have been considered an advanced culture. Rome, had the Atlanteans been replaced by tales of like an older Roman culture that was like Rome at its height, they would have said the same thing. They would have said they're utopian, they're extremely rich, they've got amazing technology, and that's what they would have told in tales about them. Plato states that it comes from older stories from Egypt, and states that it takes place, I think it was 5,000 years before the present era when he was alive. And that's roughly when Atlantis existed as a culture, only to be wiped out by a cataclysmic explosion or something of that nature, and stopped existing. Now, the reason why I say Santorini might be one of these locations is simply because the remains that are found there and at Crete are far ahead of the remains that we find elsewhere in that region, in that part of the Mediterranean. For some centuries afterwards, they've been dated to that explosion because they're buried in the same ash, and they're in almost perfect condition. You have the multi-story dwellings, you have fairly sophisticated plumbing systems, they had running water, including on the upper floors. They had road work, they had paved roads, they had all sorts of things that a lot of cultures generally didn't have, or if they did, they were sparse. They were essentially luxuries that were afforded to the royal family and to the temple or the clerical nobility or something. That's what you see in Egypt. You have these massive megaliths and these enormous palaces, but the average Egyptian lived a much more frugal life, probably 1 or 2 room homes, no plumbing or very little plumbing. The roads would have been largely dirt roads or covered in straw maybe to take away some of the effluence, and that's primarily what you have in the world at that time. So to them, a culture like the one we see at Santorini would have seemed very advanced. We also have some remains on the Azores. I can say that is another possible location, because the remains there do appear to be, they're not as large as like the Egyptian pyramids, but they are megaliths, and there are quite a few of these remains. And it does lie beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which would end, it's fairly close to that opening there, so that at some point in the past, perhaps this, whatever culture it was fairly advanced. But think about it this way, due to the cartography of the era. They could also have been talking theoretically about any coastal dwelling culture along the shores of Europe outside of the Straits of Gibraltar or down into coastal Africa. Because to them, if it was sandwiched between a couple of rivers, they would have basically considered it an island, so we wouldn't have had any clue what they were talking about. Cartography at that time was much more primitive than what you get basically during the Renaissance and after. So there's that. But most of the tales of Atlantis that people talk about today, they're talking about blimps and ray guns and communication with extraterrestrials and all this stuff. This goes to Ignatius Donnelly's work. If you don't know who Ignatius Donnelly is, look up The Antediluvian World. That was his writings. But the thing is, his writing was understood to be fictional. Some of it was... It's difficult to explain exactly. It's like within armchair anthropology around that time. Some of it was his theory that did explain why there are similar religious remains and rites, similar, species and stuff on both sides of the Atlantic and Pacific. And he said, well, maybe there was a culture between them that's actually the progenitor of all of these things, or formed almost a land bridge, and there was lots of trade, and that's why we find similarities. Now, this seems sensible. And I'm not saying that specific theory is wrong, but all of the other stuff that Donnelly wrote is simply his opinion. It's essentially a takeoff of Plato's account and of other seafaring sort of adventurous accounts, rolled up with a lot of Victorian-era beliefs regarding things like morality. And there are people that say that Plato's account as well was a metaphor. It was a metaphor essentially for how Greece and these cultures should operate, because he describes them as utopian. He says, well, the technology, their culture's perfect, there's no greed, there's no need, there's, they've got good medicine and all of this stuff, and they work together and love each other, and they're all happy-go-lucky. And some have suggested that this is actually a metaphor that was used to describe how a city-state should operate in opposition to how they actually did. Much as though, for instance, Republic. If you look at that, Socrates is claimed to be the source of that, but it appears that it was possibly just Plato's own words using Socrates' name essentially to push his material because he was more recognized at the time. So we do have to take even Plato's accounts, reliable as they tend to be, with some grain of salt here. But most of the New Age beliefs date to Ignatius Donnelly's time. In fact, if you look at a lot of the associated works within New Age, and I would even say like the Hollow Earth stuff, Agartha and Shambhala and all this stuff that's rolled in with Atlantean lore, the Thulian society sort of stuff that you hear about the Nazis, all of this material really does root in the Victorian era, and it really does root in the concept that you have sort of a wrap-up between aliens and cryptids and all of these different paranormal schools and the occult and human history, and everything sort of meshes together into this one sort of concept that at some point in the past there was a human culture that was perfect and utopian and that man is fallen. This is a very Victorian way of looking at the world. And it lent itself well, by the way, and took off from as well the concept that man was attempting to return to this sort of golden age. You see this in Nazi ideology, you see this in American ideology, and things like Manifest Destiny, the idea that you're sort of shaped by fate and you're led by all of these unseen forces and you're plunging ahead into the turmoil, completely determined to win simply because you must return to this golden age. It's your destiny and your birthright. And you can argue all day over whether this has had more of a positive or more of a negative effect on the world. I happen to lean towards believing largely it's had a positive effect until about the Cold War, when really we sort of endeavored to destroy ourselves into the modern age, unfortunately. But early on, I think it was more positive than negative. It really was more philosophical. And then a lot of the stuff that you get now is really simply a takeoff of that Ignatius Donnelly sort of era of Victorian writing. You look at sort of Himmler's ideology towards Atlantis, or some of the people living in the 30s and 40s, it's really similar. The only difference is that they have taken sort of the tale of Atlantis as this utopian past society, and they've located it somewhere else, Ultima Thule or whatever, or Agartha or Shambhala or any of these other realms. The Indian traditions have the same thing. And they've sort of used it as a justification for the existence of a racial consciousness in an era where things were getting confused. Of course, you had just gone through World War I, there was mass confusion as to people's ethnicity and racial identity, their culture. It was culture shock, really, is what it was. We're going through the same thing now, which leads me to worry that the same thing is going to happen that happened prior to World War II. I can see the same thing happening literally right now. People's racial and cultural identities all over the world, not just the West, are being completely shaken to the core. The concept of where we come from and why we're here has taken on a new importance, just as it did then. For a while, in at least most of the Western world, people felt fairly comfortable, and they sort of had a national identity. Not nationalism so much as simply they had a passive national identity. I see that breaking down literally as we speak. We see it with these riots and protests that are happening. It's beginning to happen in Europe, especially Sweden and France and Germany. We see it happening elsewhere as well. You see separatists all over the Middle East. You've got Kurdish separatists, you've got ISIS, you've got Libyan secular movements versus militant Islamists. You've got now the problem of succession to the throne in Saudi Arabia and I think it was Bahrain, or was it Qatar? I don't know which one it was, but several of these countries have like aged leaders that have multiple sons with claims to the throne, so it's going to be interesting what happens. People's national consciousness has already been shattered. The problem is now you've got a brief sort of window where things can creep in that aren't necessarily that great, and one of those is communism. Another one would be like severe racial nationalism, not just, a racial identity, which is fine, but people literally trying to purge one another. You get all sorts of authoritarian systems, you get various wars and struggle. I know this is a little off topic, but people need to understand that we may be headed into another very, very dark era in man's history, where potentially billions of people could be snuffed out of existence by something like a nuclear war. Less likely than a conventional war, maybe. Unfortunately, mutually assured destruction is still in play. So all of these new sort of Atlantean myths that you see, and like the documentary that I think I put it on my favorites list, and I'll put it in the description. Watch this documentary, because it literally wraps up exactly as I'm saying, all of these mythologies together. It takes the Platonian element, the sort of Ignatius Donnelly element, things like Nazis, UFOs, extraterrestrials, government conspiracies, the New World Order, the Illuminati, the Luminon, all of these different things, and attempts to wrap it up into one cohesive sort of philosophy. And it's also many hours long. You can literally watch this all day and not get bored. It is interesting, much as though I may hesitate to believe most of the material in it. And some of it is probably true. There probably was a culture that Atlantis is based off of, but that culture is no longer extant. Archaeology may someday uncover for sure where this tale comes from. They're thinking Santorini, maybe Crete, maybe the Azores. Some people say the Americas. I think the last one, well, it may not make sense. Again, when you look at those, mummified remains in Egypt that are, filled with, coffee residue or something, I think it takes on a little bit of a new possibility. Either that or they were farming coffee and drove it to extinction somehow, which I'm sure some people would say is true. Maybe a prolonged drought drove coffee underground and out of the continent of Africa for a while. But all of it comes from Donnelly. And the funny thing is, Donnelly understood that much of what he was writing was fictional. It's just like the works of Scientology with Hubbard. Hubbard's a sci-fi writer, okay? His religious movement, his cult, is based on science fiction. It is not real. The only reason that it even exists anymore is that extremely zealous inside administration officials within the cult of Scientology perpetuate it, pretend that it's real, because they make a lot of money doing it. The same is true of Mormonism. Most Mormons understand that at the roots, Joseph Smith was essentially a fantasy writer. And yet he writes the Book of Mormon, passes it off as real to a bunch of family and inside friends who he gets to sign some affidavit saying it's true, that he showed the golden plates or whatever. Everyone knows it's false. It's not true. He never uncovered any golden plates or talked to some angel named Moroni or Moroni or whatever the fuck it is. We know that that's the case. He was a con man, essentially. He was also a petty criminal. But people still believe it because they want to believe that there's some sort of origin that hasn't yet been uncovered to them, that sort of explains for sure where we're from, why we're here, and all of these big questions. This is what religion has done throughout the centuries. The Atlantean lore is one of the most powerful of these sort of mythologies. It's more powerful than most of them in the world today. And that's partially because it's malleable. I mean, Plato's account isn't that long, while Donnelly's account is. Donnelly, at the time that he wrote it, most people who read it thought that it was real history. They thought, wow, this explains why the human race is here. This explains how Western culture arose. It explains the race question that everyone was questioning at the time. It explains the purpose of culture. It explains utopian government. It explains we were actually advanced back then. We've fallen from grace and have to get back there. No wonder we're colonizing the third world. We're just doing what we're supposed to be doing. It basically made excuses for all of the bad behaviors and gave explanations for all the good behaviors. And it wrapped everything up really nice and put a bow on it so that it was easy to understand and it was appealing to people. And it was easy to read. It was exciting. You know, you've got the adventure aspect, you've got sort of the kind of historical aspect to it. It's supposedly educational. People love Donnelly's work. He failed at most everything else he ever did in life, but his one work there is still very much popular. People still read it today. But if you look at it, it's really sort of just a steampunk Victorian treatment of the original Platonian writings about Atlantis. That's really what it is. It's been Victorianized. To sort of explain, because we've got to remember, Plato existed in an era where things like evolution and so forth weren't really understood for the most part. Ignatius Donnelly did, and so he simply modernized it and took it as his own, and more people have read his accounts probably than Plato's accounts of Atlantis. And all of these New Age movements and the Nazis and all these groups simply seek to racialize or to sort of categorize it and to modernize it yet again. It got modernized under Donnelly, and then later, when many of those Victorian era views were outdated, people took the same powerful myth, an interesting, powerful, real, pretty much believable mythology, and attempted to modernize it again, sometimes to good effect, you know, the sort of New Age, hippie, you know, stuff like that, the crystals and the love beads and meditation and, you know, Donovan and all of that stuff. You know, it's Atlantis that we're going back to. And others to disastrous effect, like the Nazis, you know, killing a bunch of people. Or the communists. What, you think they weren't in tune to the same thing, that they didn't read the same fucking texts? Of course they did. Where do you think they got their utopian ideals from? Marx probably read Plato's account and got it into his head and just never credited him or something. So yeah, as far as Atlantis goes, when you read any of the new material on Atlantis, you're not getting the original account. And you really should read the original accounts. Because otherwise what you're getting is steampunk writing that was understood to be fictional by the person writing it. At least mostly. Some of it is valid. Some of it was a valid attempt to explain how there are so many similarities between both sides of the Atlantic. Doesn't go into the Pacific as much, but we'll leave that alone. But yes, some of that is valid. Some of it's valid criticism in theory. But mostly it was meant to be fictional. Unfortunately, most people, what they think they know about Atlantis comes from Ignatius Donnelly. It doesn't come from Plato's account. It doesn't come from any older accounts. I mean, it's like people talk about, you know, the early origins of explorers hitting the Americas, and most of what they think they know about it comes from some documentary or something. They've never read the primary accounts, you know, various codices and so forth, or any of these weird runes that are lying around all over the Americas that nobody seems to want to talk about. But yeah, the Atlantean myth is very powerful. It's very enthralling and interesting to people, and I can see it's eventually going to get modernized again. Somebody's going to take it upon themselves to either adapt the same story and try to explain it again like Donnelly did, or they'll make a similar story that just changes the name, sort of the idea of Ultima Thule or something like that, or Shambhala or whatever. And they'll do the same thing, and it will give meaning to things for people living in that future era, because that's ultimately what these stories attempt to do. In fact, that is the theory about Plato's work, as a metaphor for society, not really as a literal account of something that came before, although let's face it, it probably is. There probably was at least a kernel of truth to the story. It may be about the culture at Santorini, it may be about the culture at Crete, or both of them, if they're the same culture. It might be about the Azores, might be about anything. We have no way of knowing, unfortunately, because it doesn't draw a map for us and say, here's Atlantis, this is where it is, and give a nice account of all these other locations in the Mediterranean. Well, here's where the island used to lay before it sank into the ocean over the course of just one night. It doesn't give us that, so we have no way of knowing for sure at this juncture exactly where that kernel of truth lies. That's about all. Peace out.